Hello, everyone, and welcome to the University of New Hampshire's Alumni Current Event Series webinar titled Navigating the November Elections, organized by the wonderful Jen Woodside. And my name is Ryan Gibson. I'm an assistant professor of sociology and a faculty fellow at the Carsey School of Public Policy, both at the University of New Hampshire. And I'm grateful today to be facilitating a conversation about the November elections, in part because I believe this kind of conversation exemplifies what public universities do best. We do research, we generate knowledge, we have expertise, and we share that with the public. And in this case, the public interacts back. And through this interaction, we create a more informed public, citizenry, and those are crucial for a healthy democracy. And to guide us through this conversation today, we have two extremely well qualified panelists who will be introducing themselves. Who are going to guide us on how to understand a bit this unprecedented situation. So first, Dr. Scala.
Hello, I am Dante Scala. I'm a professor of political science at UNH and also a faculty fellow at the Carsey School of Public Policy. I've been at UNH since 2007. Just went through, I believe it might be my seventh presidential primary season. It's kind of like looking at the rings of a tree to see how old I am, how many primaries I've been through. But my focus of study is presidential elections, especially the nomination process. I also do a fair bit of work on political demography, especially of rural America, with my colleague and Ryan's colleague, Ken Johnson, over in the sociology department. Nice to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scala. And Dr. Smith?
Thanks for having me today. My name is Andy Smith. I'm the director of the UNH Survey Center and also in the political science department here at UNH. I've been the director here since 1998, 99, something like that. It goes back. But I've been, unfortunately, a pollster doing academic polling since the 1980s. So my specialties are in public opinion research, also on the New Hampshire primary and the nomination process, and kind of the interaction between public opinion and how we make our public policy.
Great. Thank you very much. And as you can tell, we have our extremely well qualified, and I might say humorous and kind panelists as well in my brief interactions with them to guide us about the election. I want to note for the audience that below on your screen, there is a Q&A function, and hopefully, and the goal ultimately is to have this be an interactive experience. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box below. Those will pop up, and about 30 minutes through, we'll begin taking audience questions. So please be sure to put those there. Without any other questions, let's dive right into it. So let's talk about perhaps a top line question when it comes to navigating the November elections, which is there just frankly haven't ever been elections like this before. To say that these are unprecedented is a little bit cliche, but they absolutely are. We've got some unique challenges. We've had an assassination attempt. We've had a change in candidates very late in the race. So how does this, from your perspective, make predicting an election like this more complicated?
Yeah, I think, it makes it important to keep in mind humility when it comes to making projections or predictions about what might occur. And just to echo what you said, Ryan, and put a couple of specifics on it. I mean, you think back to, Joe Biden, president of the United States, leaving his post as the head of his party, right? Refusing the nomination of his party and so forth. You have to go back to 1968 and Lyndon Johnson, who left, who similarly was president, was assumed to be the nominee, but then abruptly decided after the New Hampshire primary, which turned out to be more contested than he expected, decided to retire. And so we haven't seen anything like this since 1968. And even Johnson had left months before Biden did this time, right? Johnson didn't wait until the summer of 68 to get out of the race. So that's one thing that's rather unprecedented. And then secondly, on the other side of the fence, you look at Donald Trump, and say what you will about him. It's kind of remarkable to see him in his third attempt at the presidency. You have to go back to the late 19th century, right? Grover Cleveland. You have to be pretty deep into your presidential history to pick out Grover Cleveland, but he was the last president to win an election, lose an election, but then come back and win another one. So if Trump manages to pull this off, that would be, rather unprecedented. So to get back to, where we started in terms of projecting, there's just a lot to look at here and say, well, what's our end? Our social scientists like Ryan, Andy, and myself, we like to have a large number of cases to look at, right? But presidential elections, the end's rather small, believe it or not. Like, we've only had 60 odd elections, and we've only had the help of public opinion polling for maybe a quarter of those. And therefore, the end's not large. So there are a lot of times we can look back to the past and say, well, this election looks like that one or this one, but it might just be, one case or another. And I've learned, to my detriment, and again, I'll use that word humility, sometimes looking back on history and saying, oh, this one is like that one. That's the road to yet more humility, because you all of a sudden you realize, perhaps a bit too late, it's like, oh, well, not quite like that one.
I like that framing, the road to humility through those, maybe taking too much from these historical relations. Uh, Andy, anything you want to add on how we can think about, with all the craziness in this election, how we can predict it at all?
Yeah, I'd push back a little bit on the uniqueness of things, because I think a lot of the things that Dante's pointing out, yes, they're very unique historical events that are different. And Ryan, you talked about, a new nominee on the Democratic side without any vetting of a primary process, without any of the historical ability for the media to pick over them to see what their strengths and weaknesses are. But at the same time, we have an electorate in the United States that has been becoming increasingly more partisan over the last several decades. You could say starting back in the 1970s or 1980s, but it's certainly very partisan now. And when you have a partisan electorate, there are fewer and fewer people there in the middle to convince, to sway one way or the other, that are persuadable voters. And the big question for me right now is not so much are those independent voters, how few of them there are, and in the handful of states where they might make a difference. It's whether or not the bases are going, whether or not the campaigns are going to be able to motivate their party base to get out and vote on election day. So that is the enthusiasm that's there on the part of the voters. I think that if you looked at this race prior to Biden dropping out, there was certainly far more enthusiasm on the part of Republicans, despite Donald Trump's divisiveness within the Republican Party. But the Democrats were just not enthusiastic at all. Once he was gone and Harris was in there, it's like the switch got flipped, and now they are enthusiastic, and the Republicans are not so enthusiastic anymore. I think that the challenge, and before I say anything about predictions about what's going to happen, is there a way for the Republicans to kind of get their mojo back a bit, because they thought they were going to kind of go into this in a bit of a walk. Some of the other predictors that I would look at as a public opinion person would be like presidential approval ratings. Biden's job approval rating was in the dumps, and where it would have been indicative of a loss prior to him not being the nominee anymore. So there are a number of those sort of factors that have changed, and then changed the enthusiasm gap, that I think we're going to have to see where that goes over the next couple months. I think it's also really important to point out that people on this call are interested in politics. We pay attention to stuff all of the time. Most of the public are not like us. We have to remember that. And most of the public aren't really paying that much attention. They'll pay attention to things starting first after Labor Day, And then about another 20% to a third of the electorate will really start paying attention to this stuff later in October. So there's a lot of this, a lot of the electorate that really isn't fully engaged with this election yet. And not that they're going to switch parties. It's like asking, it's not like we're going to have Red Sox fans deciding they're going to root for the Yankees and vice versa. But it's going to decide, I think the decision is whether or not they buy a ticket to the game.
And he makes a good point here about it's an interesting way to think about it. Like we tend to think about how we are so polarized as an electorate, which is certainly true. And we tend to think of that as a source of divisiveness in society, et cetera, which is also true. However, it's interesting how he put it, because like how this polarization almost acts as like a giant shock absorber in our politics. Because as Ryan mentioned at the top, we've had these shocking events occur, and yet we look at the polling right now, and it doesn't look all that much different than we might have expected if it were Biden versus Trump. So it's almost as if like these things occur and then they just get absorbed, and there's a bit of unsettling, but then things settle back to the way they were. And I'm teaching a course on presidential elections this semester, and I was going over with my students about some past elections and talking about the Electoral College. And I mentioned to them, I said, look back in the 1980s and look at how one-sided things were back then, compared to now. And again, compared to now, probably you have to go back again to the late 19th century to find a period of American political history when we were so closely divided and polarized. And this kind of system is almost like a weather system. It's kind of settled in and it just keeps raining.
Yeah. So to build on that point that both of you guys are making, is especially about the what kinds of voters are coming out and how we can turn them out, and the polarization that seems to be solidifying camps with, perhaps, as Andy was saying, low information voters, perhaps not yet deciding which way they could go yet. That still brings up, I think, a broader question that I think the audience, it would help understand the audience, is how do you think we've gotten, what has catalyzed and solidified this polarization, like you said, from seeing in complete nationwide landslides in the 1980s to 40 and 50 years later, seeing very entrenched, deadlocked maps, like you were saying, that we used to see back in the Gilded Age? How can we explain those similar transitions to a more solidified, polarized electoral base?
I think the first thing is that the voters that aren't paying that much attention, they were not paying that much attention 30, 40, 70 years ago either. There's a smaller segment of the population that is really engaged in politics than and we have to keep that in mind. I think the biggest difference is what we've seen really starting in the 1950s is the ideological polarization of the two parties. So if you think about the term progressive, we use that today, and it's usually referred to as the left wing of the Democratic Party. Well, the progressive movement was a Republican movement in the 1800s, and then it was kind of adopted by Democrats in the Woodrow Wilson era. So we've had parties that are divided. We've had in the 1960s, I think of the 1964 Republican nomination process, you had very liberal wing of the Republican Party with Nelson Rockefeller and versus a conservative wing with Barry Goldwater. You saw the same sorts of things within the Democratic Party. You had Southern kind of Jim Crow Democrats making up a big bulk of the Democratic Party and the elected officials and the voters in the night before the 1960s, and that being pulled apart by civil rights movements, by the Vietnam War, et cetera. And then you've also seen massive migrations of people throughout the country that didn't seem to happen in the past. We've had a lot of people that have moved to different places, and when they move, they bring their partisanship with them. So now what we've seen is we have a conservative Republican Party, or what used to be conservative, I would say before Donald Trump. It was, I don't know how you would describe it ideologically right now, and a far more unified, moderate to a liberal Democratic Party. You don't have many people in in office, and I think that's one of the things to look at. If you look at the ideology ratings of members of Congress and the Senate, they're very far apart from each other. There's no overlap. There aren't any bipartisan senators left anymore. And that's reflective of where the electorate is. Now, did the electorate come first and then that's the way the candidates went, or vice versa? It almost doesn't matter. But we've had this the homogenization of the two parties ideologically that allows us to just stay in our camps, and I'll throw on top of that the expansion of the media universe, so you can pick and choose what news you want to hear and what you want to listen to, which reinforces that. And then on top of it, there's so much money being made in politics by reinforcing those ideological antagonisms toward one side or the other, that everybody's making a buck off it except the poor American public.
That's a great point.
To build on Andy's point, I mean, it's
please
nowadays, people's political identity is more and more their own social identity, right? In the past, as Andy was pointing out, like people would have kind of overlapping identities. Like you might be, for example, you might be a Democrat, but you also might be a weekly church-going Catholic. And so you would have these things that would kind of overlap. And so you weren't so locked into one particular thing centered around politics. But nowadays, for instance, if I asked the audience, like, what's the religious party in the United States? I think a lot of people would say, oh, well, that's the Republicans. Or what's the secular party in the United States? People might say, well, that's the Democrats. And not that there aren't religious Democrats or secular Republicans, but political identity has become more and more associated with who you are, as opposed to just kind of one among a number of things by which you identify yourself. And then you couple that with the winner-take-all nature of our politics, where, look, we don't have proportional representation, right? It's basically, we look at our presidency. It's like whoever gets the most votes becomes, well, it's a little more complicated than that, but whoever gets the most electoral votes becomes the next president. And how often do we hear these days, and not just this election, but previous ones, this is the most important election of our lifetime. Like, I don't know how many important elections in my lifetime I've seen, but the stakes are so high, in part because, as Andy was alluding to, right, we have this sense, it's trumpeted to us that if the other side wins, that's the end, right? That's the end of the United States as we know it. And that's in part due to this polarization we have, where if the others, we see ourselves as so distant from what we see as the other side, that losing becomes almost inconceivable to deal with, like the day after.
Yeah, to Dante's point on religion, I think this is a critical point that we haven't really looked at enough in our research and in American society in general, is that the country has become far less religious than it was 20 years ago, 40 years, 60 years ago.
Yes.
And church going back then was just something that pretty much everyone did, or a high percentage of the American public did. It was bipartisan. You didn't have Democratic denominations or Republican denominations per se. If you went to church, you would have Republicans and Democrats sitting in the same pew. That's not the case now. Now the second biggest predictor of how you're going to vote in any election, from president down to dog catcher, is how often you go to church. If you are a regular churchgoer, 2/3 of the time you're going to vote for the Republican candidate, regardless of what the office is. If you never go to church, 2/3 of the time you're going to vote for the Democratic candidate, and that puts in it adds a moral dimension to this, where you can look at yourself and say you're a churchgoer. You can say, well, those are godless heathens over there on the other side. They're not the people sitting on the same pew with me. And if you are a secular person and you don't go to church, you can say, well, look at all those people that believe in all this religious mumbo jumbo. How can we trust them to do these sorts of things? So it allows you as a person kind of demonize the other side based on kind of their views on larger things than politics. And that, I think, gives us kind of like a personal moral authority to be judgmental in our politics. And I think that's what, to Dante's point, you don't want to talk about politics when you know that you're in a room with people that have a different sort of background to you, because it becomes then a personal animosity rather than, hey, this is just politics.
I think that's a great point to talk about polarization and how maybe this is, and again, Dante as well, political identity become a motivator, religious identity, and the moralistic aspect of this election that is seemingly a part of the increasing polarization. Sort of staying on that train, how should we understand how the way we get news and information shapes those perceptions? Not to skip ahead, but someone in the audience has already asked about how we used to get information in the 1950s and 60s. That's changed a lot since. So when Johnson dropped out versus now and Biden, and how are we supposed to understand, like you said, Andy, about how we understand each other, but now in this new environment, this new media and digital environment, how should we understand how that affects our political process or the election?
Yeah, I think it's plausible at any rate that basically the news we consume becomes again kind of part of our identity, and it's a means of reinforcement, right? Like back in the day, you had three. One of the big what ifs people ask about is, well, like what if Richard Nixon, for example, had gone through his near impeachment and so forth and resignation during our time of partisan media, right? Would he have actually gotten out of would he have left the presidency, right? But think about what it was back then. You had the major networks, you had Walter Cronkite, you had people who were tuning in and getting news whether they wanted it or not, simply because that's what was on TV. Nowadays, I just got finished raising a couple of kids, and I'm always struck by, like, the world could be ending outside, and yet there would be channels where nothing was any different, right? You could totally tune out politics at any point when you want. And in fact, that's what I do when I go home. Like, I don't go and turn on Fox or MSNBC. I leave my day job at home. But you get this sense like, well, okay, where are you getting your news from? It's a rare person who says, well, I'm going to watch MSNBC one night, but then I'm going to watch Fox the next night, so I get both sides. It's more likely, I think, that you tune into one or the other to get the real news that's happening. And so, but again, as Andy said, you've got these people who are very tuned in to breathlessly to every event that occurs. Like Kamala Harris is in New Hampshire. I wonder what that means today. And then there are everyone else for whom it's, as Andy said, it's kind of so much background noise. And those people are going to vote too. But it's like me watching hockey. Like might watch hockey when if the Bruins made the Stanley Cup, I might tune in for that at the very end. But you couldn't tell me I wouldn't pass a hockey quiz, and I've lived in New England for 25 years. A lot of people, as Andy said, are like that, but they're still going to participate. And it'll be really interesting to see how all of this will kind of affect them, and maybe not until the very end that they'll weigh in, but they might be the ones who are decisive.
It's two the things I want to say about the news media. First off, I think the news media like to think they're far more important than they are, because now, since we've got the internet and your ability now to read newspapers from all over the world, consume news from everywhere, we've never had the ability to see and read and more news and more information about any topic in human history. And yet we consume less news now than certainly people that are my students today consume far less news now than when I was their age or when my parents were that age. So got more opportunities to consume news, but instead of consuming news, we're watching kitten videos and gardening shows and cooking shows and Sports Center. So we don't consume that much news. And to you're talking about MSNBC and Fox News or so, if you look at the numbers of people that actually watch that on a daily basis, you're looking at a couple million people, a small percentage of the American electorate that are actually engaging in what these shows that we think are just so programming our voters out there. In reality, the people that are watching those shows, largely, there's like preaching to the choir. They're just consuming things that are going to reinforce their views, but it's a small percentage of the overall electorate. And I think that's an important thing to remember, that we try to think of the media as far less important than they are, and you'll probably be a happier person.
I think that might be good advice, especially as I try to understand the next question that we have about Kamala Harris and the sort of transition that occurred in the fall. We had a situation this year where candidate dropped out very late, again, as Dante said, much later than other precedents would, have suggested. And the process for selecting the new nominee was very quick. And I think we have a lot of thoughts about that process. Do you think that it went the way it went because the class of people interested in that minutia of politics is so small? Or what are some thoughts about this late transition on the Democratic side in this? How does what we've been talking about thus far help us understand what happened there?
I think what happened was a good example of political elites
Hmm.
finally catching up to what ordinary people had seen a long time ago. What I mean by that is, you look back on Joe Biden's polling during his presidency, there have been large public concerns about Biden's fitness for the presidency, about Biden's age, going back years. And yet, Democratic political elites were all too willing to look the other way, right? And that's why you saw it during the nomination process, right? During the primaries and so forth, Joe Biden faced minimal opposition. It wasn't like Jimmy Carter facing Ted Kennedy in 1980. It wasn't even like George Bush facing Pat Buchanan in 1992. It was, a congressman from Minnesota, largely anonymous,
Mm-hmm.
who's kind of enjoyed his victory lap after this is all said and done. But then the debate occurred, right, at the beginning of the summer. And then I think the facts were just so incontrovertible that even political elites, who, again, as I'm fond of saying to my students, and I know Andy is too, politicians are always concerned about being reelected. You can explain so much of their behavior that way. They could not avoid the facts anymore. And then what we saw happen over the next few weeks was basically how presidential nominations used to happen, which is behind closed doors among political elites. I know our audience is savvy enough to know that when all of these Democrats at the convention were applauding Joe Biden for being so patriotic, Joe Biden was standing there knowing that all of these elites applauding him were applauding him for leaving. And they were applauding him for doing something that they all were pressuring him to do for weeks. But this was kind of a throwback to, Kamala Harris on the phone as soon as she got Joe Biden's endorsement for 24, 48 hours, getting elite support. That's how things used to be. Political elites would choose nominees, not the broader public. And it raises an interesting question. Are elites better at this than the general public is in terms of choosing nominees that then the general electorate weighs in on?
Yeah.
Andy, I
Point,
can't, your smile is evident. What's going on there?
it makes me think about my colleagues that are political theorists. This goes back to Aristotle and his
Absolutely.
categorizations of government. And democracy was always the worst government because it was the easiest to devolve into dictatorships. And we have a republic in the United States with institutions that are designed to try to prevent those sorts of things. And it does raise the question. And if you look at our original Constitution, the only part of the federal government that had popular input, meaning voter input, was the House of Representatives. And that was designed to be replaced every 2 years. So we wouldn't have kind of the mob rule that could take over. So there's been great concern throughout history about what happens when we have too much democracy. And it raises the question, is democracy too important to be left to the people? And sometimes it is Dante's mentioned the elites, and these are elites in politics, but they're also elites in our government and our society and our business world. And it's the money that matters, I guess it eventually kind of comes down to. The people who have a financial stake in the country or in that party, in the direction of the country, they make the difference. So I think one of the things that really happened that got Biden out was when the money dried up. When you have all of these big donors in the Democratic Party saying, no more checks for you, that I think is really the indication that they have to go. But to your point, it does raise that question in my mind, and I'll just throw it out to people here. And it's in New Hampshire, this is probably sacrilegious to say, is do we have too many primaries? Do we have too much public input into our nomination process? And should there be a more space, more room, more sway given to the people in the smoke-filled rooms?
Speaking of that kind of elections, I think that's a great way to leave that, because that is a really open question. Let's talk about polling, which is like the unofficial primarying. We got a lot of questions from the audience about polling, and that is one way in which elites do interact with the general public writ large, right? Elites look at polls, they respond to polls, and so that interaction mechanism, I think, is quite interesting, right? Because then people have an effect. So we got some questions about, to what extent does polling influence the election itself, and what are the kinds of people that are answering the polls? I mean, we've talked a lot about who the motivated voters are, or the voters that are keeping up with things. Are those the kinds of voters that are answering the polls, or how should we think about this interaction going forward?
Let me jump at that one. I hate to
Please.
say it. I'm one of the people who is guilty of calling you at dinner and so forth,
Yes,
bothering everybody about the polls. The whole polling industry is going through a paradigm shift right now. And it's similar to what happened in the 1960s and 70s when we moved from in-person interviews to telephone interviews. And it took a decade or more for us to develop best practices to be able to do telephone interviewing with true random sampling, with methods for selecting people, following up, et cetera. But that model is obviously broken down. By the 2000s, with the advent of caller ID, call blocking, cell phones, et cetera, you saw response rates for even the major media organizations down around 5% or so, meaning that if I call 100 households, only 5% of those households are going to complete the survey. And it was pretty clear by the late 2015s or so that there was starting to be a real differential response, in that the people who were responding to surveys tended to be the ones who were far more engaged in politics, and the people who were not responding to surveys were people that really didn't care much about it. So we started to lose these things. And in the 2020 election, in the 2016 election, there was very much an underreporting of Republican support for Donald Trump in 2016, and for more generally Republicans in 2020. And I was on the committee that looked at these things for the American Association of Public Opinion Research. And what we seem to find out is we're having partisan or differential response rates among partisans. So Republicans were just not answering polls. I had a colleague down at a university in Florida that was keeping track of the number of people that would say Trump, 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 and then some curse words and slamming the phone down. Well, they didn't complete the survey, so we couldn't put them in one bucket or another. We had a pretty good idea of where they were going. So there is a lot of problems there with the polling industry, and we have not developed best practices yet for how to do this. And it's going to take several years to manage this transition from telephone surveys to web-based surveys. And it's going to happen. It's happening already, but it will definitely happen simply because of the cost. Cost of a telephone survey is orders of magnitude higher than the cost of doing even a well-done web-based survey. So we're
Hmm.
really working at this as an industry. So I would say I would be very cautious as a pollster to put much stock in any given poll without looking at the methodology, the history, the background. Do they use random sampling or not as a
Hmm.
critical thing before we start to do that? But to the question of are polls influential, I
Yeah.
think they're only somewhat influential is that they become part of the campaign in the sense that
Hmm.
they may be some way that you can look at it and say, well, if my candidate's losing, I guess everybody's staying home, I'll stay home. And that's kind of what it is. It becomes kind of the negative advertising uh, uh, of a new version of negative advertising, because negative advertising that you see, these attack ads, they're not designed to get you to switch who you're voting for. They're designed to keep the supporters of your opponent at home. And I think that's a way this might happen with polling, is that it dampens enthusiasm. But there's almost no research that shows that polling actually influences the results of elections. I guess you have to go back to like the Jimmy Carter election of 1980, Carter Reagan, where the exit polls were released early before the polls were even closed in California. And a lot of Democrats stayed home. And there's some evidence that Democrats lost a few House seats in California because Democrats said, well, presidential race is over. I'm not going to go sit through traffic and go to vote when my candidate's already lost. So I it's always a good story out there, but there's very little evidence to support the idea that polls really impact the results of elections.
And Dante, I want your thoughts on that, but if I could just one follow up for that, Andy. I remember hearing a little bit about the story about how they went to Biden and explained to him that his paths essentially were no more. And that was one of the convincing arguments they had made for why he needed to step aside. And the paths, for him, I think it was through the Midwest. And they said, Kamala, well, she might have a path through the South and the Midwest. But all of that would have been based on polling, to some degree, like if those paths existed or not. And they seem to have taken that pretty seriously. So instead of maybe thinking about the polls influencing people to influence election, what do you think about polls influencing elites and how they think about elections?
Well, they certainly influence where they spend their money.
Absolutely.
Polls are a big indicator of where the campaigns think they have a chance. They're doing their own internal polling and I think probably it used to be we would disparage internal polling because we thought it was biased. But to Dante's
Mhm.
point, there's such fear of losing an election that their internal polling better be really pretty accurate, or they're going to make their decision based on bad data. They have more incentive to having their data to be right than some of the other people. So the internal polling, I think, really is influencing where the money goes.
Interesting. That's very fascinating. Dante.
Yeah, I mean, I come at this as a consumer of polls
Yeah,
rather than a
me too.
producer of polls,
Don't look
like
into the
Andy.
sausage making process. Trust me.
Well, I mean, it's I would say one thing that for the audience to keep in mind is like beware the narrative.
Hmm.
Like the we academics love to throw around the term narrative,
Hmm.
but it's interesting how like polling can help to build even one poll when it's dropped at the right time in the right place can help to build a narrative among elites, including media elites.
Definitely.
And I can go back like 2022 is a good case in point, right? There was a narrative building up that, well, and it was kind of based on historical precedent that, well, there's a red Republican wave growing in 2022. And it's going to be a big Republican year, lots of Republican success and so forth. And historically, that made sense because you have a Democrat in the White House. It's typically the midterms, a rough year for the party in power. And there were enough polls to give credence to that. But as it turned out, the narrative was pretty far off in a number of places, especially here in New Hampshire. And I'll say I was kind of guilty of thinking this is going to be a rough year for Democrats, and it turned out to be remarkably smooth for New Hampshire Democrats. So you really, as someone who talks to the media a good bit, it's really easy to get sucked into the narrative and the so-called conventional wisdom that, well, this is how things are. And why is this how things are? Because everyone agrees. Well, everyone agrees on something until it turns out to be wrong. And then everyone agrees on something else. And we're always, my goal as someone who's looking at all this is trying to stay a step ahead of things. Because once it's said on CNN, it's already, as Andy was saying, kind of like that solidified conventional wisdom. You're not necessarily going to learn anything new there.
So one other thing I should say with media and the polls,
Please.
we see so many polls now. There's more national polls, more state polls than you've ever seen before. The reason we see them, first off, is the price has gone down considerably because of the web-based surveys. But secondly, polls are clickbait for media organizations. The business model for media organizations is now clicks on the website. It's not so much the commercials and the advertising stuff. It's clicks on the website, regardless of whether you're a newspaper, a TV station, a radio station even. And polls, people see a new poll, especially you'll see these things. Shock poll says this. You immediately go click on that because you want to see what's happening in the world. It's like wanting to see the score in a baseball game. And for the media, publishing a poll and getting money from that, each time somebody clicks, you hear a little ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching in the treasurer's office at the media organization. It's a lot cheaper to do that, put a poll out, than it is to send reporters out and actually do some shoe leather work and understanding what actually is going on within the electorate.
Wow. Well, that is a great way, especially ending on polling with the polling master himself, to finish the moderated panel portion of the webinar. I can't believe we've already moved through 40 minutes of it, but now we're going to enter more in depth the audience Q&A. So if you haven't already, now is the time to put your question in for our clearly well-qualified experts on the topic. I'll go ahead and start with some questions that we got early on. One question we got was that in almost any prior election, this one's from Bradford Cook, a candidate indicted, to say nothing convicted of a crime, would have had a hard time running for office. How do you think, I think we'd have to go back to maybe like Eugene V. Debs before we're talking about convicted, getting millions and millions of votes. How does that influence, or how should the audience understand how that influence is navigating the November elections? Or does it really not have an impact at all? Is that sort of was in the past, feels like?
It's interesting. There's Trump, and then there's everybody else, right? I mean, I think that I don't know that, the audience member is right, like in the sense that indictments tend to have a negative effect on a politician's career. And I think for most, right, it still does. I mean, look at, Senator Menendez in New Jersey, for example, case in point. However, Trump is, again, kind of I mean, I remember thinking about this last year when once again Trump was, kind of waltzing to the nomination of his party. And again, you think of, whatever you say about Trump, he has been the dominant figure of the last decade of American politics. Like Andy's students, my students, UNH undergrads, this is basically the president they remember, their first president. They might remember Obama a little bit, but remember 2008, right? They were, gosh, 4 or 5 years old, something like that, right? So, but Trump, I mean, it's in terms of the indictments and so forth, obviously it hasn't affected his ability to gain partisan allegiance. And in fact, it's basically allowed him to double down on that. And in a sense, it's circular because Republican elites are, Trump is just, it's interesting, the contrast between Trump and Biden. Biden, was really very much a creature of his party. He was always a loyal party member. And when his party told him to step aside, he's president of the United States, allegedly the most powerful figure on the planet. when push came to shove, he stepped down. Look at what Trump did. Trump is not a creature of his party. Trump remade the Republican Party in his own image. And how many politicians can we say that about in our lifetimes, right? For good or bad, right? And the indictments was just one more example of how he was able to use this to secure his hold on the party, not to lose it.
Well, Andy, I know you have a response to that, but I'm gonna kill two birds with one stone, because I think this next question will be a part of your follow-up answer. It was a question in response to something you had said earlier. What makes you say the Republicans are not as enthusiastic about Trump? They say his rallies are still very enthusiastic. I doubt his supporters have changed much, regardless of who the opponent is. And I think that question speaks to what Dante was just saying, right? Like, how many political figures have been able to remake a party in their own image? We've clearly seen excitement on the Democratic side, but clearly, as the audience is saying here, there seems to be still a lot of excitement for Trump. So I'm answering Dante and sort of answering that question as well. What are some of your thoughts on Trump as this singular figure?
Well, he absolutely is a singular figure. I've not seen anything like this before. But I think to Dante's point about how the parties respond and the people within the parties respond brings me back to about a friend of mine used to say in Wisconsin, a journalist. He would say that rationalization is the second strongest human drive.
What's the first?
I'll leave it to our audience to figure that one out. But we can rationalize away anything under the sun if we want to.
Yeah.
And kind of reminds me that of a time, I don't remember the exact year, but it was in Louisiana when Edwin Edwards, who had been indicted, I think he'd even been in jail, was running for office against David Duke. And he made bumper stickers that said, "Vote for the crook. It's important." So people have kind of tried to attack this in different ways, but there have been times when we've seen people, not presidents, but people in lower office, use it as a badge of honor, frankly, to that you've been indicted. I think of our friend Buddy Cianci down in Rhode Island, getting reelected after serving time, or Mayor Curley in Boston doing the same thing. So you can use these being indicted as truly as a badge of honor, is to prove that you are doing something that was right, and they're doing everything they can to try to get rid of you, even if it's not fair in the political world. And I think that's what Trump has been able to do with this. But I would say that how do I say that Trump's not as much support there? Well, trend lines are one thing that I do look at in polling. And if you get trend lines about how interested you are in the election, it's kind of a generic question. You can say I'm very interested to not interested at all. The percentage of Republicans who said they were very interested, very excited very excited about the election coming up before Biden dropped out and after has stayed the same or gone down. Whereas among Democrats, it's definitely gone up. They are much more excited, much more interested in the election than they were before. That, I think, is an indication there on a broader scale than just, say, rallies of the overall interest of the electorate. And I think Republicans, the biggest challenge, as I said, as we started off, the biggest problem here is how the Republicans are going to get their mojo back if they want to win the election in the fall, because I don't think they've got it right now.
And that gets back to one of your first question, Ryan, about, how unique an election this is. We're kind of going through the American equivalent of a British snap election, right? Where we have this very truncated, abbreviated campaign. And it's interesting to think about, will that be to Kamala Harris's benefit? Because one, she didn't have to run the gauntlet of endless primaries and fundraising and appeasing different factions in the party, publicly speaking, and debates. She just got the nomination. And then secondly, we're down to 62 days. People are going to start voting early pretty soon. And therefore, again, getting back to that enthusiasm gap that Andy mentioned, it's not that Republicans aren't enthusiastic. The question now is, are they enthusiastic enough? And sure, you can make the case, well, Harris, maybe Democrats are on this kind of sugar high. and they'll come back to earth. However, again, it's only 62 days.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just enough time or just not enough time for Republicans to recover from what's occurred.
Yeah, the
Speaking,
problem that Republicans have is there aren't many opportunities to really attack Harris.
Mhm,
The debate that's coming up next week
mhm,
is an opportunity. I don't think it's going to be as significant as the Biden debate back in
mhm.
June, but this debate that's coming up is a real opportunity for them to do that. After that, I think that the smartest thing for the Harris campaign to do would be to adopt Joe Biden's strategy from 2020, which is stay in the basement, don't go out, don't answer questions, and just kind of fly above the radar or above the crowd and not get engaged in these sorts of things and just rely on the sugar high lasting long enough. Because if there's not anything negative that comes out, what's going to change the course of this election?
I think that's a great point because what we're seeing in this short time frame, we got two questions on how should we be thinking about the Electoral College and how is that affecting the way we think? We had someone say, if I'm not in a battleground state, it doesn't even feel like my vote matters so much. And we've seen really since the start of the snap election, this push towards battleground states in large part because of the Electoral College and the way the system is designed. So could either of you speak to the role of the Electoral College and battleground states in this election?
Yeah, I'm afraid, the feeling our audience member has is not, it's not off the mark. I mean, basically, we're coming down to 7 states that will decide the next president, right? Arizona, Nevada in the West, Georgia, North Carolina in the South, and then, as Ryan mentioned earlier, right, the three Midwestern states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. New Hampshire, even, which often gets mentioned as a swing state, I think right now, and Andy may agree or disagree, is kind of like on the outside looking in. And again, it's the Electoral College math, right? Harris has a significant lead. New Hampshire, like Minnesota, is a Democratic leaning swing state. So if you're Donald Trump, if you're the Republican Party, again, follow the money. Do you invest a lot of time, scarce resources? Like, where am I going to send JD Vance today? JD Vance can only be in one state at one day, and there's only 62 days. Do you spend resources on New Hampshire's 4 electoral votes, or do you send Vance? Okay, JD, one more time to Wisconsin and Michigan. You know this flight by heart by now. That's politicians always want to be elected and reelected. And the Electoral College rules are just relentless. But it really truncates who has a real say and who an actual say and who doesn't.
I have a feeling that we're going to see nowhere near as many advertisements for president as we've seen in previous years. New
Interesting.
Hampshire has been, we haven't voted for a Republican for president since George W. Bush in 2000. And even then, if Ralph Nader had not been on the ballot, Gore would have won New Hampshire and the presidency. But it's been drifting further and further and further into the Democratic camp. Over the last 20 years, not as fast as it was in, I think, in the early teens or the early 2000s, but that means we're just not going to get the campaigning. You talk with people that live in other big states. I'm from Ohio originally, and I talked to people in Ohio the last several cycles. They said we don't get any campaigning. There's nothing for president in Ohio. Why should they advertise in Ohio? So we're going to see, I think, a little bit less and less advertising going forward.
Wow. Well, we have time for one more question and then some closing thoughts. And the last question I think is a really good one. We got a question about how traditionally politically insular offices at the county, even local levels are becoming increasingly politicized. And especially now we're seeing voting processes and becoming like Georgia's election board, for example, was brought up in the question, being more attached to national politics. What do you guys see in that trend for the future in terms of policy and politics that even the structure itself seems to be polarizing like its electorate a bit more? And then after that, we'll move on to concluding thoughts. So either of you want to take up that question?
You know, it's a dangerous game we're playing with the politicization of voting itself. And this goes back decades. I mean, you can go back to 2000 and Al Gore and George Bush in Florida. And the Secretary of State of Florida, right, was a Republican. And, the idea that we have, in a lot of states that the Secretary of State is a partisan position is problematic, especially in these times. And I don't think it helps with voter confidence. And in addition, you have states running elections, and rather than, and then you have partisan officials running elections. That's just a formula for a lot of, factors that I think that it can help to undermine voter confidence. And that, I think that to me is something that, Trump or no Trump, kind of we need to think about more carefully in terms of how do we restore voter confidence down the line.
I agree with you 100%. I think the problem isn't that there have been elections that have been not quite as good one way or the other. It's whether or not people are going to trust the outcomes of those elections.
Yeah.
And that is a definite problem that we have now. And Brad Cook was on the call, and he's somebody who I really applaud, who's been more concerned about voter confidence and willing to look at that in a bipartisan manner with former Congressman Dick Sweat in New Hampshire, where they're taking an honest look at what actually is going on in elections. And I would have to throw out a shout out to some of our colleagues, especially a friend, Charlie Putnam, a UNH guy who is a moderator in Rollinsford, and the stuff that he has to deal with. These are people that are doing these jobs really for no money, they're just trying to be good government people. And the fact that they're getting attacked is really an incredibly unfortunate thing, because nobody else really wants to do these jobs. They're thankless jobs. And I give everybody credit who engages in them.
I agree. We love civil servants and volunteerism, and that's what makes democracies work. So we have to appreciate that. And so that sort of leads us to the conclusion. I have 4 pages of notes. I've learned a lot. Hopefully the audience has gained a lot. And I would like to leave the last 2 minutes for both of you to just say parting words, if last bit of advice or evidence for people trying to navigate the 2024 elections. If you had just a couple words to send them off with, what would you say?
Well, on a somber note, I used to say, on election day, I always looked forward to election day. I still do, but I would kind of quote to my students a book called The Making of the President. And there's this passage about the peaceful transfer of power, that we would have these elections and we would have the transfer of power without violence. And it was seen as this kind of uniquely American thing. I can't say that anymore to my students, right? I can't quote that anymore, or I can't quote it. I can quote it nostalgically, but I approach elections now with this sense of apprehension, including this one. So that's on a somber note, that's kind of in the back of my mind and sometimes in the front of it.
To Dante's point, to follow up on that, the most important election in American history was the election of 1800, which is the one that set up that peaceful transfer of power from one party control to another party control. And that's what we're in a difficult spot to look at now. But I'm going to put my pollster hat on. For all of you people that love to follow the polls, be very cautious about following polls. And especially even more so about polling aggregators. There are some good quality polls that make up those aggregators. There's some crummy polls that make up those aggregations. And try not to cheerlead based on what one poll says or another poll says.
Well, I think that's great advice for helping us navigate this election. Thank you so much for joining us. If you had a great time at this webinar, you can find more information at unh.edu/alumni. And I really do hope you come to more, because clearly there's a lot of information to glean. Thank you once again, Dante and Andy, for your expertise and knowledge and sharing that with the community. This is, again, what we're designed to do. So thank you very much, and everyone have a great day.